I'm Andy Drummond. I'm here to talk about my new book. It's all about unbuilt railways, which is not a very promising subject, I know, but bear with me. Let me whisk you back in time to 1890. In June of that year, a letter appeared in the pages of the Scotsman newspaper, and after several paragraphs of closely reasoned argument, it ended thus. When the thorough condemnation of Aultbea by the Royal Commission becomes known, and the Gairloch proposal for a railway to Loch is fully before the world, as we hope it will soon be, different opinions may be expressed in the Lewis and other districts. In the meantime, if the Aultbea and Garve railway be, as we believe, virtually defunct, is it not the right course for all who desire to raise the fishermen of the northwest Highlands and Islands from their present miserable condition to unite in urging on the government the supreme importance of the proposed railway from Aultbea to Loch as immeasurably superior to any other scheme that could be brought forward? There we have, in two rousing sentences, the argument for a railway in this part of the world. First, and I would suggest foremost, it was to compete with the Garve to Aultbea railway proposal. Secondly, it would greatly support the fishing industry. There was mention here also of a Royal Commission, and there were plenty of those touring the northwest at the time, and we shall stumble across them several times in the course of this evening. The letter, by the way, was signed John H. Dixon of Birlinn, a name that might be familiar to some of you. Here he is in his pomp. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there were signs that the suffering people of the northwest, and particularly on the islands, were in rebellious mood. Decades of deprivation under rapacious landlords and years of famine exacerbated by the potato blight have brought about death, poverty, disease, and enforced emigration. At the beginning of the 1880s, crofters on Skye, Lewis, and other places began to put up a fight. Now, this is not the time or place to go into those events, sometimes known as the Crofters' War. Suffice it to say that the government in London was made sufficiently anxious that it sent out the Napier Commission to look into and hopefully resolve the economic and social problems of the region. In this sketch from 1883, Lord Napier is third from the left, and Sir Kenneth Mackenzie of Gairloch is second from the left. What was clear from the Napier report was that land ownership was at the root of all social and economic problems. Unsurprisingly, however, a radical redistribution of land was not forthcoming. Instead, some significant reforms were passed in law to alleviate the worst of these problems, and an attempt was also made to get around the problem of land by improving the chances of employment. And so the promotion of the fishing industry came into sharp focus. The fishing industry of the northwest was at that time centred almost wholly on Stornoway. It was here that fishing boats gathered in the early spring to catch the herring. Although there were fishing boats based on Lewis and Harris and the mainland coast opposite, the work was primarily carried out by boats from the east coast. But local men and women found employment on those boats and in the processing of the catch. Over the course of the last quarter of the 19th century, strenuous efforts were made by local people through their representatives in Westminster to build up the infrastructure for the fisheries. The greatest single problem was that of getting the fish to market. Steamers could do the job, but they were slow, and railways were much faster. But at the start of the 1880s, apart from a railway terminus at Strome Ferry, there was no railhead further north than Oban, which was scarcely convenient for Stornoway. It was a very large gap which many local communities longed to fill. And so, by the end of that decade, several proposals were being touted. Now, on this map, drawn up by an investigating commission in 1890, we can see the main proposals. In the far north, a railway line from Lairg to Laxford. Slightly further south, the Coleraine to Loch railway, and then the Garve to Aultbea line, and then came, of course, the Aultbea to Aultbea route. Further south still, there was the extension of the Strome ferry line as far as Gairloch, and the building of a railway from Tindrum to Fort William, and then on to Mallaig. Not to be outdone, the people of Skye and Lewis were promoting their own solutions. railways all over Skye, from Aultbea to Dunvegan and Uig and Don Lewis, several wonderful routes out of Stornoway, not all shown here. Everyone was very optimistic. Regarding the Laxford proposal, one minister of the Kirk declared that the railway would be the making of the place. Of the Skye proposals, an optimist announced that there were a railway from Dunvegan to Portree and a line to Mallig from Fort William. He had no doubt at all the people in Skye would become very prosperous. Mr. Dixon at Inveran House up the road here stated unequivocally that I am convinced, as the result of many years' knowledge of these coasts, that a railway down the romantic valley of Loch MAREE would do more to benefit the struggling fishing population than any other measure that could be suggested. Even the Westminster government seemed convinced that something had to be done, and that that something was a railway. Unfortunately, as is often the way, the government didn't consider it a project to undertake itself. Building a railway anywhere in those days was very much an affair of private enterprise. Yes, you had to gain parliamentary approval, but with a few and very minor exceptions, you couldn't expect any government grants or loans to help you build a railway once that approval had been given. So you more or less had to throw yourself on the mercy of one of the larger railway companies, principally, for this part of the world, the Highland Railway Company, bunkered in Inverness and jealously guarding what it regarded as a God-given monopoly of transportation north and west of Inverness. And as was proved time and time again in the latter part of the 19th century, the Highland Railway Company didn't want any potential rivals to its terminal at Stromeferry or later at Gairloch. One could write a book about the futile efforts of the local railway promoters in the face of government lethargy and the Highland Railway Company's ill-concealed opposition. And indeed, one has, and here it is, a quite impossible proposal. But let us skip past the nitty-gritty of that weary battle with the Highland Railway Company and let us instead dream a little. Let's look at what the Aultbea Railway would offer. The very first practical thing to be done was to have the proposed route of the railway properly surveyed. This was undertaken by Thomas Meek and Sons of Edinburgh, a well-respected family firm of engineers, in whose portfolio at a later date was the new hydroelectric scheme at Kinlochleven. But back in 1892, they produced a very detailed plan for the Loch MAREE and Aultbea Railway. Slightly eccentrically, the plan identified not one, but 3 railway lines. The first, confusingly labelled on the plans as Railway Number 3, ran southwestwards from Achnasheen Station on the Dingwall to Stromeferry line for a distance of 7 chains and 13 yards, which is about 150 metres. This took it clear of Highland Railway land and into Virgin territory. Now, the height above sea level at Achnasheen is 490 feet, and in a fine piece of surveyor's exactitude, the datum line, which was effectively their own sea level against which all vertical heights would be measured, is given as 630 feet 6 inches below the level of the ordnance benchmark on top of the 30th milestone from Dingwall at the side of the road between Achnasheen and Lochgowan, marked X on the plan. Those of you anxious to find out more might seek this milestone. It's about half a mile south of the station, but I think it has long since vanished into the undergrowth. The second section, which was Railway Number 1, was by far the longest at 29 miles. It went all the way to Poolewe. To begin with, rather than follow the existing road west out of Achnasheen, it circled round the back of Ledgowan Lodge, passed south of Loch Acroshk, and remained well south of the road to take advantage of the hillside contours, before looping up to enter Glendocherty. From the top of the hill, which was the highest point on the line, our train would then rattle down the glen at a fairly steep gradient for 3 miles. It would swoop around to the west, circle just south of the village of Kinlochhew on a long viaduct, and then rejoin the road, the present-day A832. And then it hugged the south shore of Loch MAREE as far as Slatteldale, where the road subsequently veers due west towards Gairloch The railway instead heads north along the shore straight for Poolewe, which is where it gets interesting. As most of you will know, the southern shore of Loch MAREE is by no means a level plain at the western end. There are two major bluffs of rock which loom 300 feet above the waters just east of Aultbea. Problem? Ha, not at all. The Meeks envisage here a tunnel, or rather two tunnels 100 yards apart, and we shall return to them shortly. Railway number 1 ends at Poolewe and is immediately succeeded by railway number 2. This split may have been to allow for the line to terminate at Poolewe should finances run dry. Number 2 heads northwards along the east shore of Loch Ewe, skirting round the back of Osgood Mackenzie's Inverview estate and terminating in Aultbea, where a new pier would be constructed for steamer traffic. And it was no modest stubby thing either. This one had to be 180 yards long, so that at the far end its deck would stand 25 feet above the low water mark. A very respectable pier indeed. The total length of the railway then was to be 37 miles, 2 furlongs, 9 chains and 20 yards, precisely. Fairly short, but very exciting. Over its whole length, 30 bridges were to be constructed of spans between 15 and 90 feet. There were to be 3 major viaducts, one across the glen behind Kinloch Ewe with a length of 325 feet and 50 feet high, another of 200 feet across the inlet at Aultbea, about 2 miles east of Taladale, and a third of 315 feet across another inlet a mile further on, both of these about 35 feet high. Now, one railway viaduct seems to attract thousands of tourists to the west of Scotland. Just imagine what we could do with 3. And the railway would run within gawping distance of the renowned Victoria Falls. And then, of course, there was the magnificent double tunnel. The east tunnel would be 200 yards long, approached by a long incline. The west tunnel, 137 yards, both buried under 200 feet of mountain. We see in this picture a photograph of Tolly Hill taken from Inverran, and beside it a cross-section from the railway plans, looking rather like a medical emergency. The 2 tunnels were separated by a stretch of 100 yards above an 80-foot drop. No viaduct is mentioned here on the plans, so we must suppose that the railway would cling by its fingernails to the hillside, as indeed it would have to do after exiting northwards into the second tunnel. Now, one thing you will notice from these plans is that the railway went nowhere near Gairloch. This was not an oversight. We have a sketch map from an early stage in the proposal which did show an alternative route, but this also went nowhere near Gairloch. In fact, it ran along the north shore of Loch MAREE, if you can imagine that. But when a luckless Royal Commission proposed in its report that the railway be diverted via Gairloch, John Dixon was adamant that this was not an option. It would, he said, add 15 miles to the route and introduce 2 tricky summits at an additional cost of £100,000. He didn't mention in his counter-argument those equally tricky double tunnels, of course. Gairloch was to be bypassed for 2 other reasons. Firstly, the whole point of the railway was to get fish from Stornoway in the Minch to market. Gairloch was never identified by anyone as a possible port for fishing vessels or steamers. And secondly, I suspect a railway passing through the grounds of Flowerdale House would not have met with the approval of Sir Kenneth Mackenzie or his gardener. Oops, sorry. This was a railway then of the more bracing type, full of opportunities for clever Victorian engineers to do what they did best, build viaducts and bridges and stations, 4 of them, maybe 5, conquering the landscape with ballast and iron. It was to cost, depending on whom you spoke to, anywhere between £290,000 and £330,000. Now bear in mind that £1 in the 1890s is worth very approximately £100 today. So that would have been about £30 million, which I can assure you is cheap. But of course, as with any other large engineering project, you might as well double the estimate right from the start. All in all, a lot of money would need to be found. Even with the most sanguine of business plans, it was not a sum of money that would ever be recouped. John Dixon estimated revenues at around £5 per mile per week, that is about £10,000 a year, which, when set against operating costs of £6,000, meant a handsome yearly operating profit. But still, you had to find your £250,000 for construction. So, who were the promoters and supporters of this desirable railway line? They came in two sizes, a handful of the wealthy and a larger body of the penniless. Among the wealthy, pride of place goes to John Henry Dixon, a Yorkshire lawyer who had retired very early due to ill health. He had established himself as the organiser of the district, and he liked to be photographed in Highland dress. He rented Inverran House just east of Poolewe, and from there he plotted the campaign for the Aultbea Railway and against the Liverpool Railway most admirably. Over a period of 3 years, he wrote numerous letters to the newspapers and a similar number to MPs and government ministers. He organised and he minuted public meetings of crofters and fishermen. He buttonholed passing royal commissions and let them know his opinions, and he submitted professionally printed manifestos to the Scottish office in London. Such was his zeal and output that he even had headed notepaper specially printed for his letters. The heading read, "Proposed Fisheries Railway to Aultbea and for the Lewes." Next in importance was, of course, Sir Kenneth Mackenzie, 6th Baronet of Gairloch, who owned most of the land over which the railway would run. He was largely a figurehead in the campaign, being wheeled out for important meetings with, say, the Secretary for Scotland in Whitehall. Now this, by the way, is an extract from the Book of Reference which accompanied the plans for the railway. Book of Reference details all parcels of land, buildings, streams, fields, and so on, over which the railway would run. This particular page describes part of Taladale, and the owner's name, all the way down the third column, Sir Kenneth Mackenzie. Next after Mackenzie came Maria Ann Banks, second daughter of the coal magnate MAREE Banks, a man, it has to be said, who was not well loved in these parts. Maria, along with her French husband Paul, lived at Ardlair House on the north shore of Loch MAREE, and the couple took an active part in the campaign for the railway. Two estate owners of Torridon were also named promoters. The first of these was the Earl of Lovelace, here on the left, who owned Bendamph House with its 12,000-acre estate. His main claim to fame was that his first wife was Ada Lovelace, daughter of Lord Byron, and now known, amongst IT nerds like myself, as the world's first computer programmer. His next-door neighbour was Duncan Darragh of Gourock and Torridon, who owned the 32,000-acre Torridon estate, here shown on the right, bought using his inherited fortune from the sugar plantations of the West Indies. At a late stage in the proceedings, Duncan Darragh dropped out and was replaced by a man of equal value, William Ogilvie Dalgleish of Coolin, a linen manufacturer of Dundee. Such was the enthusiasm of those promoters that they even promised to put up some money to move the project along. Sir Kenneth was good for £5,000. Darragh, Lovelace and Dixon promised £2,000 each, while Maria Banks offered a more canny £500. But these were tiny amounts of money relative to the projected cost. But at least it was money. There was understandably considerable support for the proposal amongst ordinary people who had no money at all. In May 1889, for example, there were reports of packed public meetings in Poolewe, Gairloch and Aultbea. A number of local fishermen stood up in November 1889 at a large and enthusiastic meeting in Aultbea. One, John MacLeod of Sands, stated that Aultbea was a far better landing place for fish than Liverpool, and that if they got a terminus here, the fishing could be thoroughly worked. This could not be if Liverpool were chosen. Various resolutions were passed at that meeting, and the Scotsman noted approvingly that it lasted over 3 hours, and most of the speeches were in Gaelic. And there were even public meetings in Stornoway and smaller villages on Lewis. Lewis, in fact, was bitterly divided between supporters of an Aultbea railway and those of an Ullapool railway. At one point, the Free Church minister back on Lewis wrote to the Scotsman and ventured to assert, without fear of contradiction, that should a census be taken tomorrow of the entire population of the Lewis, we should henceforward hear as much or as little of an agitation for a railway terminus on the moon as for one at Aultbea. Rather sadly, the moon is still more likely to get that railway than Aultbea. And it was the rivalry with Ullapool which supercharged the Aultbea campaign. Dixon was very clear about this. On every possible occasion, he ran down Ullapool and promoted Aultbea. He also drew maps, like this one here. In one letter to the newspapers, he had this to say: that Ullapool is distant some 15 miles from the Minch and more than 50 miles from Stornoway, that the mouth of Loch Broom is narrow and closely surrounded by lofty hills which must conduce to squalls and calms, so that access by sailing vessels must be, as it is, often tedious and difficult, that the approach through the archipelago of the Summer Isles is intricate, so that those not acquainted with the navigation require a pilot. These are all facts that your readers may verify by looking at a map. That Loch Ewe is directly opposite to and only some 34 miles distant from Stornoway, that it is the nearest inlet on the mainland to the Lewis, that it opens directly from the Minch and has an entrance a mile and a half wide, that there are no islands between Stornoway and Loch Ewe, nor any hills surrounding the mouth of the loch, and that Aird Point at Aultbea is only about 38 miles from Stornoway. These are also facts that your readers may verify on the map. John Dixon perhaps played a little fast and loose with his geography. Loch Ewe is directly opposite to Stornoway. Could do with some cartographic refinement, I believe. Remarkably, however, his words stuck with various commissions of inquiry and led to some bizarre discussions in the House of Commons. Which brings us rather neatly to the frequently laughable efforts of government bodies to get a grip on the problem. There were several attempts by Whitehall to give the impression of being competent to resolve the transportation problem, and none of those attempts were very convincing. The first took place in June 1889 when Lord Lothian, shown here, the Secretary for Scotland, decided to take a tour of the Northwest Highlands and Islands. On his arrival in Stornoway, he boasted that he was the first Secretary for Scotland who had come here, which is not necessarily the best advert for governmental care of its people. Lord Lothian duly processed around Lewis and Uist, and he visited Loch Inver, Ullapool and Gairloch to listen to their competing claims for a railway. In Gairloch, he heard from John Dixon just why Ullapool was a non-starter. But it all did very little good. His lordship declared quite confidently that, with reference to a railway on the mainland, he couldn't give an opinion as to where the terminus should be. How that could best be done was a matter for future consideration. Future consideration. Unhappy words. Lord Lothian met a deputation of Aultbea supporters in London in February 1891. John Dixon was there, as was a clutch of randomly chosen MPs. And in a nod to the lower classes, a Glaswegian fish curer and a building contractor from Edinburgh were permitted to attend. The Torridon neighbours, Darragh and Lovelace, made up the numbers. The well-known arguments were rehearsed. Fishing, crofting and tourism were talked up. The building contractor stated that Loch MAREE had very attractive countryside for tourists to view, more so than Ullapool, of course. And Lovelace showed that he was in touch with the rebellious spirit of the times by stating that he was of opinion that an extension of railways would restore the sheep farming and potato culture in the west of Scotland to something like their former dimensions. The Scottish Secretary duly thanked the deputation for their information and promised faithfully to lay it before his colleagues in the government. And a fat lot of good that did them. However, back in the summer of 1890, Lord Lothian had done something. He'd sent out a fine body of men constituting the Western Highlands and Islands Commission, whose task it was to inquire into certain matters affecting the interests of the population of the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Sadly, they didn't make a very good job of it. They crisscrossed the West Coast and Islands for 6 weeks solid, and then wrote up a lengthy report. The report didn't come to any definitive recommendations. Instead, it deployed large numbers of words in recommending emigration as a cure for all ills. And its map-making skills could also be questioned. Have a look closely at the position of Ullapool on this map, which was included with the report. The report met largely with derision in the Highlands and in Westminster. Soon, Lord Lothian found it necessary to send out a second body of men comprising 2 railway experts and a famed Arctic explorer. This group of 3 formed themselves into the North West Coast of Scotland Railways Committee and proceeded to accumulate evidence over the summer of 1891. Like their predecessors, they made a hash of it, and this was reflected in the length of their report, which was barely 3.5 pages. They suggested that the sea approach to Ullapool was beset by rocks, that Aultbea was scarcely worth bothering about, and that money would best be spent on extending the Strome ferry line to Kyle and the Fort William line to Mallig. The railway projects for Ullapool, for Aultbea, and several other interesting places were no longer on the radar of Westminster. And even when the Aultbea scheme occasionally did pop up, no one in London was quite sure about the geography. Here on this map, if you look closely, Loch has poured into the Gairloch and Ullapool has migrated up to Braemore. Or, even more thought-provoking, this map from a civil servant based, I'm afraid to say, in Edinburgh, whose plan for a railway to Gairloch and Ullapool, marked in blue pencil, covers some challenging ground. None of which, we are happy to say, stopped John Dixon and his fellow promoters from pressing ahead with their railway. Now at this point things become a little hazy. Spurred on almost certainly by the passing of the Garve to Ullapool Railway Act in 1890, which gave parliamentary approval for private individuals to risk their money on a hopeless scheme, Dixon and his colleagues opted to do the same. Despite the fact that the various investigative commissions had given no encouragement and that rival schemes were looking far more likely, they instructed their solicitors in London to prepare a private bill to authorise the LOCH, MAREE and Aultbea Railway. It has to be said that even their solicitors in London were very doubtful of success. In the face of Whitehall unhelpfulness at every turn, the lawyers rather pathetically asked, "Oh, what can the promoters do but decide to withdraw their bill?" And the Highland Railway made its feelings known by writing to the Scottish Secretary announcing that the company would do everything it could to oppose the private bill. Nevertheless, according to some records at least, this bill did make some progress. The Scotsman reported that the MP for Wick gave the bill its second reading in the House of Commons on the 21st of April 1893. Curiously, although the MP's intervention was reported in the Scotsman, there is no record of it in the parliamentary business published by Hansard. The Commons was on that date fully occupied with the 12th day of debating the Government of Ireland Bill, and there was just enough time left over in the evening to discuss such matters as whether the dog tax should apply to crofters' dogs and why government messengers in Edinburgh were using their days off to work as waiters. But Hansard makes no mention at all of the Aultbea Railway Bill. In any case, even if that second reading did take place, nothing ever happened as a result. The Aultbea Railway faded away and died, which means we could never get one of these. And the railway never really recovered from its death. 3 years later, in 1896, Westminster passed the Light Railways Act, which was intended to promote the building of light railways all over the British countryside, in an effort to inject a spark of life into the ailing rural economy. This act streamlined the whole process of promoting a new railway and even offered a small amount the taxpayers' money to assist in building it. And while a host of other communities put forward their ideas, including those really noisy neighbours up in Aultbea, there was no application for a light railway to Aultbea. So we never got one of these either. Another chance was offered in 1918. Towards the end of a war which threatened to overturn all of society, the government realised that something had to be done to improve the lot of people in the Highlands. Even before 1918, there were signs of popular rebellion in sporadic land grabs. And as an extra incentive to the government, there was concern that the efforts of the Royal Navy to keep the German fleet locked up in the North Sea were heavily reliant on just one single line of railway track running from Perth to Inverness and onward from Inverness to Wick. So yet another government commission was sent out. This was the Rural Transport Scotland Committee, whose brief it was to report back on the provision of transport in the Highlands and Islands, and to make recommendations for improvement. The committee toured most of Scotland during the summer of 1918 and then produced a weighty, informed and informative report. The report came to the obvious conclusion that transportation in the Highlands and Islands was shambolic. Roads were in a very poor condition. Such railways as there were totally inadequate. And let's not even get started on steamer services. Remember that was 100 years ago. So the committee made a whole list of excellent proposals: the improvement of roads, the integration of steamer and railway services, even, such were these revolutionary days, a call for railways and McBrains to be nationalised. Evidence was invited from every community. Aultbea made a strong bid, and in lieu of John Dixon, who had long before departed to his second retirement in Poolewe, the new Mackenzie of Gairloch submitted plans and documents. Quite what those documents were, we don't know. Most probably they were the Meek's plans dusted down. But although the Rural Transport Committee suggested no fewer than 17 new railway lines, the committee did not feel justified in recommending the construction of a railway from Aultbea to Aultbea on Loch Ewe. The best they could suggest, discounting a boat service along Loch Ewe, was a road motor service to Aultbea, there to meet the Dingwall to Kyle Railway. A similar road-based proposal was suggested as a landward escape route for the inhabitants of Torridon, lest they felt forgotten in all of this. But an improved road to Loch Ewe had to wait until the next war, when one was hastily constructed to service the Royal Navy base there. But we can take some consolation in the fact that none of those 17 railways recommended by the civil servants were ever built either. So what are we left with? Certainly no railway, and if it hadn't been for 2 world wars, would there even have been a decent road from Aultbea to Aultbea? Perhaps a steamer ploughing its way down Loch MAREE would have been sufficient. I must share with you the story of my brother and his young family, who spent several family holidays at Gairloch in the 1970s. One fine summer's day, my brother picked up a local guidebook in the shop, and on the basis of its recommendations, the family set off to Poolewe Bay to await the small steamer, which apparently sailed up and down the loch during the summer. It was only after waiting 3 hours that my brother began to grow suspicious. Checking the guidebook again, he discovered that it was a facsimile reprint of John Henry Dixon's classic guide of 1886. Just like the train to Aultbea, the Mabel never arrived. History is history. We can't speculate on what might have happened had the railway found both approval and finance and, more importantly, the blessing of the Highland Railway Company. For a period of some 30 years over a century ago, the proposals for railways depended largely on the state of the fishing industry. And after 1918, that rationale slowly faded away, and the only sensible reason for building or maintaining a railway was probably tourism with some commuter traffic on the side. And had the Loch MAREE and Aultbea Railway survived at Dr. Beeching's proposals, then perhaps today it would bring tourists and Hollywood film crews to the area, all eager to experience all those viaducts and that double tunnel above Tolly Bay. And so I would like to leave you with this map of how the railway network might be today. Thank you for your time.